Support for WABE comes from Capital Good Fund, introducing Georgia Bright Solar Lease Program, a new rooftop solar initiative designed to create pathways to equitable and inclusive solar, sustainability, and monthly savings for Georgians. Learn more at georgiabright.org.
You love free, and at Ameris Bank, so do we. That's why we're proud to offer worry-free, hassle-free Ameris Bank free checking. Manage your money your way with convenient access to digital, mobile, and telephone banking, all with no monthly service fee or minimum balance requirements. At Ameris Bank, we're with you. For more information or to open an account, visit our local bankers in person or online at amerisbank.com/free checking. Other fees such as overdraft fees may apply. Ameris Bank, member FDIC, equal housing lender.
Happy crossover day. It's going to be a good day. I can already feel it. I can just look at the senator from the 28th back there and tell it's going to be a good day today.
A critical deadline under the Gold Dome this week as lawmakers scramble to keep their bills alive by clearing at least one chamber.
That's right. We're talking about crossover day, and we'll tell you about the bills that have lived and died.
Plus, a heated debate about immigration sweeps the Georgia legislature.
Fixing policy in the face of unspeakable tragedy is not politics. It's doing the right thing to ensure something like this never occurs again.
It is easy and tempting during an election cycle to target minorities and immigrants in order to score political points.
We'll talk about this with WABE immigration reporter Emily Wu Pearson.
I'm WABE politics reporter Sam Gringlas.
And I'm politics reporter Rahul Bali. It's week 8 of the Georgia General Assembly.
And this is Dome Scramble, a podcast about the legislature and more from WABE News in Atlanta.
So, Sam, it's crossover day turned into crossover night. Let's tell the folks where we're at right now.
Well, first of all, we are still here. We are still at the Capitol. Outside the windows, it has turned dark outside, and we're overlooking the South Steps. And on either side of us, you've got the Senate and the House chambers. You can hear the bell, and in the background, the doorkeepers yelling, voting, voting. That means it's time for a vote. The doors close. The lawmakers all shuffle in and hit the green or red button to cast their votes. And this is what crossover day sounds like under the Gold Dome.
And actually, that's, when people ask me the differences between the House and Senate, this is one of those. The Senate, the doorkeepers run out the door and yell, voting, voting, voting. They don't do that in the House. All there is on the House is just a bell. So it's just one of the interesting differences between the two bodies here. One other thing I have to mention, because we are still now a couple of hours after dinner, the smell of barbecue in this place. I've had dinner, and you can still smell the barbecue up here on the 4th floor where we're sitting.
The sights, the sounds, and the smells of crossover day. And I'd say overall, they're mostly pleasant ones.
Yep. And one of the interesting things that people have been talking about is renovating the state capitol, which actually appeared in the 2024 state budget that was signed today.
Yeah, this is something I wanted to mention before we get into the meat of some of the more pressing legislation maybe that crossed over at the Capitol. And that's this $83 million that's been earmarked to restore this building that we're sitting in that was built in the 1880s. And part of that funding, which I thought was really interesting, is to re-gild the Gold Dome. So that means adding this thin layer of gold to the dome, and that would happen as early as this year because I guess the gold kind of wears away. It's not really meant to be a exterior building material. Fun fact, the Capitol is gilded in gold now, but it was tin until 1959, and that's when gold from Dahlonega was carried on a literal wagon train down to Atlanta. It stayed the night in Piedmont Park before being brought downtown for placement atop our lovely Gold Dome. So a little fun fact to start off our podcast today.
By the way, in the budget that Governor Brian Kemp signed today, here during crossover day, is another $300 million in the amended 2024 state budget to build a new legislative building for offices, for lawmakers, and for hearing rooms, a new parking deck, and then a bridge connecting everything back over here.
All right, Rahul, it's crossover night, as we mentioned. This is a critical deadline because bills have to clear one chamber in order to have a chance of becoming law this session. Now, there's some exceptions to that, but overall, this is a really key deadline. At this point, you and I, we've had our pizza and our subs, the bills are flying, and I want to ask you about a testy debate that happened this afternoon over the state's film tax credit. Tell me what happened.
So look, nobody argues the success of Georgia's film tax credit, that it's been rocket fuel for the growth of the state's film and TV industry. So many major productions that have come out of the state of Georgia. Look, National Geographic's Genius MLK-X show that's streaming right now, it features the only meeting between Malcolm X and MLK. But if you look carefully, it's the floor that's 2 floors directly below us. So I mean, that's just one example of all the things that have come out here. Now, look, here's what's happened. In recent years, there have been concerns developing about it. First concern, the cost. Okay, it's above $1 billion now. The state's budget is $35 billion. So you're talking about 2, kind of creeping towards 3% of the budget. So you've got concerns around that. This whole idea of transferring and selling the credits. You know, if a production company's budget, tax credit, is not as much as their tax bill, well, they've got these extra credits. Well, they've been allowed to sell them and make money off those. And then the last thing, what's the return on investment for Georgia? So you've had this new bill, House Bill 1180, and it should be pointed out, the author of the bill is State Representative Casey Carpenter, who is a big supporter of the industry. But he's the one who's also writing this reform bill. And what it does is it adds in, some specific conditions to bring more business to Georgia, to have more Georgians working on film projects, to have more Georgia vendors, to have more filming in rural Georgia. So more return on investment, also some new rules around transferability. But you know what? Here's where the concerns come in. Here's where the debate comes in. State Representative Long Tran, who's a Democrat, this is what he had to say about his concerns.
I started working in the film industry in 2014, and I can tell you that we still have a long way to grow. We still have to fulfill our promises to all of our growing next generation of film workers, whether they're carpenters, plumbers, electricians. We promised them if they went to the technical colleges, if they went into these fields, costume design, that they would have work. And now we're bringing uncertainty.
Now, after the debate, I did talk to Casey Carpenter, who is a Republican. And look, he says, bottom line is, this is about making it more financially sustainable for the state of Georgia.
I just think it provides us a structure that everybody as appropriations can feel comfortable with how much money they have to spend without fear that we're going to run the state out of money in hard times.
So House Bill 1180 easily passed the House, now heads to the Senate, but it's important to note that there are a number of skeptics of the credit over there. Now, speaking of over there in the Senate, you covered probably one of the most controversial debates of the night, Senate Bill 180, a religious liberty bill that opponents say would sanction discrimination against LGBTQ people.
Right. SB 180, the Georgia Religious Freedom Restoration Act, would limit local and state governments from enforcing or passing laws that infringe on a person's religious beliefs. This is how Senator Ed Setzler, a Republican, explains it.
Before a government can force a person to violate their faith, it must first show a compelling government interest, and that interest is accomplished in the least restrictive means possible.
Georgia law currently does not explicitly prohibit discrimination based on sexual orientation. Here's Democratic Senator Kim Jackson, who says the bill could harm LGBTQ families like hers.
Legislation like this is an invitation. It's an invitation for Georgians to consider how they want to discriminate. It's a permission slip.
Now, I do want to give a little bit of history that it's interesting that this bill has come back now, because this was a debate that was had here about 8 years ago. That similar legislation made it all the way to then Governor Nathan Deal's desk, but he vetoed it over concerns for business here in the state of Georgia. And we should note that the Atlanta Metro Chamber and the Georgia Chamber put out a letter opposing this version of this bill. But remember, this is not a done deal. It did pass the Senate, now goes to the House, where it probably faces more pushback, especially if the business community gets more involved.
You know, something I think we both noticed this week is lawmakers moving rapidly to respond to current events, things that are happening in the news, and then a day or two later, there's a bill that is suddenly being introduced or having traction in committee. And, you covered one of these bills, or a couple of these bills that were introduced by Democrats to protect IVF treatments in Georgia after an Alabama Supreme Court ruling raised fears about the fate of those treatments. Could you tell me a little bit about what these bills would do and what you heard from the lawmakers who are proposing them?
So let's start off with the legislation around IVF and just the concerns, because what happened in Alabama was basically this discussion that a frozen embryo, so where fertilization treatment has already happened, and then that embryo is frozen, that could be considered a child by state law. And all the implications that come out of that. And what's basically happened is most of those treatments have stopped in Alabama. And of course, that's raised concerns around the country, including by Democratic lawmakers here. The bottom line is Democratic lawmakers are saying that state law is murky on this issue. It's not clear. Here's Democratic State Senator Elena Parent.
Our code is riddled with all kinds of places where there are question marks. And therefore, we need this strong, very clear, very simple statement that embryos outside of a uterus are not children.
Now, the other legislation that Democratic lawmakers did file has to do with contraception, kind of the same idea that, state law is murky. We should make it very clear that there is a right to contraceptives in this state, and that there's a right for healthcare providers to deliver contraceptives to their clients and to their patients. Now, one of the things reporters asked was, will this legislation get through? State Senator Parent was just like, that's just the priority of leadership. Do they want to push this legislation through? Senate Majority Leader on the Republican side, Steve Gooch, pushed back saying, look, you know what the rules are. But then State Senator Parent pushed back of, look how quickly you're moving on other legislation like immigration legislation, which was another hot button topic that's hit here.
Exactly. Republicans moved rapidly this week to advance legislation to crack down on illegal immigration, and that was after a college student was murdered in Athens last week. We're going to talk more about that later, but first I want to tell you about the specifics of this particular bill that passed on crossover, HB 1105. The tape that we heard in the introduction, that was Representatives Houston Gaines, a Republican, and Pedro Marin, a Democrat, debating this bill. HB 1105 would require jailers to notify federal authorities if they suspect a person in their custody is, quote, a foreign national. It also creates reporting requirements, including the number of, quote, foreign-born inmates, and it calls for state funding to be withheld from municipalities that don't comply with these rules. Now, Republicans say up until now, municipalities have often looked the other way when they interact with someone who is undocumented, but Democrats warned that this bill basically endorses racial profiling.
Sam, one of the things I'm going to be watching for as this bill moves forward is the feedback from law enforcement on the legislation and possible changes that they would want. We're going to talk more about the context around that situation in Athens and the bill later in the show with our immigration reporter, Emily Wu Pearson. But let's stick with crossover day a bit longer. And you know what? We've been talking about how bills could live or die. And I just wanted to remind folks how bills come back to life. And one example is Senate Bill 88. Sam, real quick, tell our audience about the bill.
So this bill would basically restrict discussion of sexual orientation or gender identity in schools. It was not scheduled for a vote by crossover day, but I know you had a conversation with the bill's sponsor that suggests that, what seems dead may not be.
And that's what I want our audience to know, that if a bill doesn't get through, there are ways around it. I did talk to State Senator Cardin Summers, who's the author of Senate Bill 88, And he hinted that there may be conversations about adding that bill to other bills that have already crossed over, hence this term. You could, a House bill that's already crossed over to the Senate, if you add language, for example, the language from SB 88, then when the bill passes the Senate, all it has to do is go back to the House for a final vote, and your bill has come back to life.
And Rahul, this can't go into just any old bill, right? It has to go in a bill that deals with the same section of Georgia code, though whether these bills really are similar or on the same topic is often pretty loosely applied.
In the end, someone's got to make a decision whether, and the term I've heard around here generally is it in the same zip code? Rules can be bent around here, but, one more thing I do want to mention about crossover day of what legislation does actually die. Sometimes what leadership tells lawmakers is, you know what, your bill didn't make it to crossover, let's let it go. It's almost used as an excuse more than the formality of it.
Real quick, I want to point out that we often cover a lot of controversial bills that divide along party lines, but the legislature does often act in a bipartisan manner. Many bills passed unanimously or close to it. And I want to raise an example from this week. The Georgia House overwhelmingly approved a tax credit for the purchase of the cost of firearm safety training classes or safe storage devices. This legislation would create a $300 optional tax credit. Sponsors say it will decrease gun theft, suicide risk, and pediatric deaths. Gun violence is the leading cause of death for children and teens, and Democratic Representative Michelle Au said that this action, though maybe small, is still quite remarkable.
And that is to show that there is a way forward on addressing the issue of gun violence in our communities. Incentivizing secure storage and personal responsibility is something we can agree on. It's something we can get done together.
Democrats have called for more action on gun safety as Georgia's Republican-controlled legislature has moved to loosen restrictions on firearms in recent years. So Democrats are heralding this as a huge win for the push to curb gun violence, while Republicans were happy enough that it kind of fits with some of their personal values of personal responsibility and upholding the Second Amendment.
And before we go, I just want to mention something that's coming up next week. Qualifying week here at the state capitol. That's when a number of candidates, including congressional candidates, along with all the candidates for state legislative office, have to make their way 2 floors below us in one of 2 rooms. Over the left, where Sam is sitting, is the room for the Democrats, and over here to the right is the room for Republicans. You go in, you put your money down, and you qualify to be on the May ballot. And ahead of that, you get retirement announcements, people making the decision of, hey, I'm not going to run again. We've heard from some lawmakers, but most notably, Senate Minority Leader Gloria Butler, really a big deal that she's stepping aside and retiring. Minority Leader for the past 4 years, a state senator since 1999. And I talked to her afterwards about stepping aside, and this is what she had to say.
I don't care who asks me my age, because I'm happy to have lived as long as I have and to be able to do the kinds of things that I'm doing and have done.
And she wanted you to know that she was 82 years old and that, you know what, she still had a lot of living to do, just not here at the state capitol.
And I think that is a good lesson for all of us, that there is life outside of these walls at the Capitol. So hopefully we won't stay here too long tonight. And Rahul, I think you should take note. I'm sure your family would be happy if you palled around the Capitol just a little bit less. All right, so lots to follow next week, but for now, you can stay up to date with some of the most important bills that we're tracking at WABE by checking out the WABE Bill Tracker at wabe.org/2024 Bill Tracker.
Let's take a break here. This is Dome Scramble from WABE.
At a time when information continues to come at us faster and faster, sometimes you need to hit pause and rewind. NPR's Throughline takes you back in time to the source of the news stories filling your feed. Find NPR's Throughline wherever you get your podcasts.
Support comes from Mercedes-Benz of Buckhead, where the power of electric meets the power of Mercedes. Introducing a lineup of electric vehicles, the EQB, the EQS sedan and SUV, the EQE sedan and SUV. The vehicles are all electric. The feeling is all Mercedes. Mercedesofbuckhead.com.
Welcome back to Dome Scramble. A heated debate over immigration is unfolding this week at the Georgia Capitol. That's after a man who officials say entered the U.S. illegally was charged in the murder of Laken Riley, a 22-year-old Athens nursing student.
GOP state lawmakers now say they're looking for ways for the state to target illegal immigration, as Republicans and Democrats argue over the fraught politics of immigration policy. To put these developments in context, we're joined by WABE reporter Emily Wu Pearson. Emily covers immigrant communities in Georgia. Emily, welcome to the show.
Hey, Rahul and Sam. Thanks for having me today.
So, Emily, immediately the immigration status of this suspect became just a flashpoint in Georgia. Can you tell us what we know and what we don't know at this point about him?
Yes. So what we know about him, an Immigration and Customs Enforcement spokesperson in Atlanta told me the suspect is a 26-year-old citizen of Venezuela. He was arrested by ICE at the border near El Paso, Texas in early 2022 for unlawful entrance into the U.S. ICE did parole and release him. In 2023, he was arrested in New York and charged with, quote, acting in a manner to injure a child less than 17 years old, unquote. Also a license violation. New York police did release him. Earlier this week, he was arrested by UGA police and charged with murder, among other crimes. The ICE office in Atlanta issued a detainer, which allows them to put him in immigration detention depending on what is decided. We also know he is not a UGA student, but he did have an apartment in Athens. What we don't know why he was paroled and released. Immigration parole works differently than criminal parole. When someone is paroled in the immigration context, this means officials see a case where the person could be in humanitarian crisis. ICE did not disclose why he was paroled, but some Venezuelans do qualify for something called temporary protected status that prevents them from being deported back to Venezuela because conflicts in the country are so severe. We also don't know why he wasn't convicted for those New York charges or why he was not put into immigration detention at that point. We also don't know why he was in Athens or for how long.
So we also heard a swift response from Republican lawmakers, many of whom have deep connections to the University of Georgia and who already have been criticizing President Joe Biden over immigration ahead of the 2024 election. Let's just listen to a little bit of what Governor Brian Kemp had to say during a speech this week in Athens.
All of Georgia and the entire country have been rocked by this inexcusable and avoidable murder. Laken's death is a direct result of failed policies on the federal level and an unwillingness by this White House to secure the southern border.
Emily, Republicans say this tragedy was avoidable. Can you tease that out a little bit? What typically happens when someone makes an illegal border crossing?
Yeah, that's a really good question. A lot of things come into play when someone crosses into the U.S. illegally because they don't have legal documentation or prior permission. U.S. law does provide for people to cross into the U.S. to seek asylum at ports of entry. The Biden administration has actually limited this in the last few years, where if you are trying to get into the U.S. and you go through other countries to get into the U.S., you have to seek asylum in those countries first, or you will be deported. It's also a little abnormal that he was arrested in New York and was not necessarily held by ICE. It works differently in different states. In Georgia, there are places that would, when arresting somebody whose immigration status is not solidified, would probably report them to ICE and have that person detained in some fashion.
So one big criticism we've heard from Republicans is this idea of law enforcement in liberal cities and counties not doing everything in their power to assist federal immigration authorities. Can you explain this idea of so-called sanctuary cities? Give us the landscape here in Georgia, because, you know, I remember a couple of years ago, the General Assembly passed a law outlawing these kind of policies.
Yes, they absolutely did. A sanctuary city is a really broad term for places that have policies that either welcome migrants, like immigrants and refugees, with programs that help people acclimate to their new cities. It also could look like policies that make cities minimize their participation with ICE. So Georgia outlawed sanctuary cities in 2009. It's kind of symbolic. There's not one criteria that makes something a sanctuary city. In 2016, the state reiterated this, doubled down on this, and required municipalities to demonstrate that they are following federal immigration laws in order to continue to receive state funds. Those are just kind of the rules. Athens in particular, especially in the light of this killing, has been criticized by GOP lawmakers for being a sanctuary city. Overall, Athens-Clarke County does have limited interaction with ICE. For example, Athens-Clarke County authorities have said they check the criminal history of people arrested and they'll hold people who do have outstanding warrants, but they don't keep unauthorized immigrants jailed if they have no criminal history.
Democrats warned Republicans this week against exploiting a tragedy to score political points. And they also noted that congressional Republicans blocked a bipartisan immigration bill this month after former President Trump criticized it, basically saying he didn't want to take the issue off the table ahead of his reelection bid. Emily, what was in this federal bipartisan proposal that now appears to be dead?
That's a great point to bring up, Sam. That bill had quite broad bipartisan support, even with a prominent conservative Republican from Oklahoma, James Lankford, negotiating. That bill was pretty strict on immigration. It would have raised the bar for what counts as an asylum claim. It would have added thousands of border guards and hundreds of immigration judges. It would have created harsher penalties for trafficking fentanyl, which is a huge issue at the border right now. And it would have allowed the president to close the border completely if illegal crossings had hit 5,000 in a day.
All right, Emily, we've been talking about policy specifics, but I want to zoom out for a moment. You know, on the one hand, there are real challenges at the border with shelters and cities being overwhelmed by an influx of people showing up at the southern border. And there is clearly real hurt in the Athens community, you know, people who feel like this could have been prevented maybe if different policies had been in place. But on the flip side, immigrants have long been a stand-in for people's fears and frustrations, and those have been exploited by politicians. So I wonder if you could say a bit more about why this debate over immigration is just so fraught, especially heading into 2024.
I think it's really easy to blame immigrants for the failures of lawmakers because in theory, we choose the lawmakers to represent us. These last few elections and this year as well, people talk about how no one represents them in politics. They don't feel seen. And so immigrants become a scapegoat for lawmakers because politicians have a bigger platform than someone who's in a fraught position. It's not easy to stick your neck out as an immigrant. As a politician, it's way easier to say, you know, immigrants shouldn't be in the United States instead of admitting that, you know, myself as a politician, I might have voted for policies that underfunded the resources the country needs to truly vet and process immigration cases.
So back here at the Capitol, action quickly turned to some of the bills focused on illegal immigration. But, you know, you've been covering some of the other bills that weren't getting as much attention earlier in the session. Those were designed to help and encourage immigrants who enter the U.S. legally, especially when it comes to workforce.
Yeah, you're right, Rahul, and I appreciate you mentioning this. This session, there are a bunch of bills that really aim to make Georgia better because of immigrants. One would allow immigrants who are refugees, who helped the U.S. military in overseas conflicts. A lot of them are translators, could have been medical professionals. Those folks have special refugee statuses, and there's a bill that would allow them to qualify for in-state tuition in Georgia universities to go to school. Another would allow DACA recipients, kids who were brought to the U.S. as minors and have largely lived and been educated in Georgia, to have in-state tuition to continue their educations in Georgia. Both of these bills would help address the brain drain and educated workforce worries that we hear about. There's another bill that hopes to allow vetted immigrants and refugees who were doctors in their origin countries to take medical licensing exams in Georgia, and then if they pass, they can become doctors here. Currently, these people have to start school from scratch, and oftentimes they would have to pay out-of-state tuition. So that's a huge barrier to addressing what we see all over Georgia as a lack of medical professionals. There's another bill that would expand access as to who could get driver's licenses, and that's framed in a way that would add people to the workforce. It helps people get from point A to point B so they can drive to work. There's a lot of positive bills that people are trying to help bolster the state, bolster the economy, create more community that have had some motion this session.
Emily, I want to pick up on that thread because, so often when we talk about immigrants, it's in this context of the political debate over illegal immigration. But your beat covering immigrant communities is so much more diverse and multifaceted. What do you wish listeners knew about immigrant communities in Metro Atlanta and in Georgia?
Man, I wish that people knew about immigrants in Atlanta, in Georgia, and in the South. I think people underestimate these folks. We already know that Georgia is a growth state. There's business growing, there's tech growing, there's research growing. Immigrants and refugees are a significant group driving that. And that's cool, but what's cool about it to me is they're coming to the U.S. with zero. They're starting from scratch. They're learning a new language. They're learning a new history of a place. They're going to school again. And some people are learning how to navigate democracy for the first time. And these immigrants, they're facing at least twice the obstacles of non-immigrants, but they're still doing all of the same community building on half of the luck.
That's WABE's Emily Wu Pearson. Emily, thank you so much for joining us on this really, really busy week.
Thanks for having me.
And that does it for this week, this crossover week. Dome Scramble is a production of the WABE Politics team. Our producer is Brendan Rivers. Our managing editor is Alex Helmick.
You can get more Georgia politics every Tuesday and Thursday with the Political Breakfast podcast, and check out wabe.org/under the gold dome, where you can find our bill tracker and keep tabs on all the legislation we're following. We'll be back next week.
Sounds Like ATL is a music documentary series that takes an in-depth look at the artists amplifying Atlanta's famed music community. Built around a desire to highlight Atlanta's diverse and world-renowned music scene, each episode features unforgettable, intimate musical performances by fresh new musical guests, each with exclusive interviews about the stories behind their music. Listen at wabe.org or wherever you find your podcasts.
The world has changed, from shifts in power to a mental health crisis. So with all this social change, how do we balance the human desire for empathy, the business need for productivity, and the hope to make an impact in our community? This is a new podcast, The Social Impact Leader. I'm Jeff Shinabarker. Join me as we explore people doing work a little different. Available every Wednesday at wabe.org/podcast or wherever you get your podcasts.
WABE.